Good morning. In one of our meetup studies, we're beginning a lesson series on the Sermon on the Mount. And if you turn to Matthew chapter 5, I'd like to start there today and just share a thought with you that occurred with me last week and got me going down this path of studying on some of the martyrs of the Bible. So as I'm preparing to begin this study in Matthew 5 for our weekly meetup, one of the Beatitudes has been on my mind, and I've been thinking on it a lot. And that's in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 10. And Jesus is talking about his kingdom, and in my mind, there are plenty of scriptures that emphasize, like John chapter 18, where Jesus talks with Pilate and plainly tells him, my kingdom is not of this world. It's not a physical kingdom. He says, I think in Luke 17, where the kingdom won't come with signs to be observed, where people can say, there it is over there, that's the border. It's not a physical place with a boundary like an actual real country. It's a kingdom that's within us, that's in our hearts. It's a spiritual kingdom. And that to me is emphasized so much all throughout this sermon of Jesus in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, that it's not a physical kingdom, it's a spiritual kingdom. And so it's going to exist within our hearts, but we will continue to exist within the kingdoms of this world. And that's going to bring persecution. That's going to bring a lot of ridicule. And for some people, it's going to bring great pain and suffering. And so Jesus, not speaking of a earthly kingdom that would go to Rome and throw out the shackles of the Roman Empire and take the armies there and conquer them and be victorious. Rather, he talks about a kingdom where we'll suffer, where those who are citizens of this kingdom will be subject to constant ridicule, insults, harm, and injury. And so in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 10, he said, blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness. And he emphasizes for the sake of righteousness, that when holding on to your ideals and the ideals and principles of Jesus and his teaching and his kingdom, if you suffer, Jesus says you are blessed. Because this kingdom belongs to you. It is your kingdom. You might not feel like you have a place in this world, but he says, if you suffer for righteous sake with patience and endure it, the kingdom is yours. And all kinds of evil against you falsely on account of me, he says in at the end of verse 10, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men cast insults at you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And that's Jesus' way of saying you come from a long line of persecuted, faithful men and women. That is your heritage. These couple of verses pointed me in the direction, as Jesus said, so they did to the prophets before you. It got me going through the Bible and realizing that all throughout Old and New Testament, there are righteous, faithful men and women who died because they held on to their beliefs, because they were faithful to God and they paid the ultimate price. And Jesus says, as you and I as Christians, as citizens of this kingdom, of his kingdom, this is our heritage. This is where we come from. A long line of persecuted people who suffer for their faith. And so it brings up all kinds of questions for us to ponder. Would I, in the face of such persecution? You know, in America, I don't know that I could say we are a persecuted people as Christians. Yeah, we might feel like it, and people on Facebook might make a big deal and think they're persecuted just because some liberal media outlets attack Chick-fil-A or because Starbucks won't say Merry Christmas or something, but that's not persecution in the same way that Jesus talks about here. In the face of such persecution, in the face of death, as those mentioned in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10, they were told to be faithful even to the point of death. Would I be faithful in such situations? And so I'd like to share with you some thoughts this morning about the idea of being a martyr and what it means. And we're going to start by defining it. What it means to be a martyr, according to the dictionary. And there's a reason there's several definitions, a couple of different dictionaries, but I really like this one from Webster's. A person who voluntarily, and that brings up the possibility that you could avoid it. You could get out of it if maybe you backed off on your beliefs or principles, or you lied or weren't faithful to God, that there might be a way out of it. But a person who voluntarily suffers death as the penalty of witnessing to and refusing to renounce their religion. The English word martyr, the etymology of any word is almost always an interesting study. And it's always a complicated process of one word gets transliterated from one language to another. But it comes from the Greek word, which is martur, martyr. And you can see where it just made the easy transliterative leap into English from the Greek language. But in Hebrews chapter 12, for example, the key definition of this word in the Greek is witness. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, if you're looking at a Greek interlinear, you would notice that in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, where it says, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses, you would notice in the Greek it is martyron, where we get our word and is translated in other places as martyr. Because the reason why you suffer this punishment, the reason why you suffer death as a martyr is because of what you are witnessing, because of your testimony, because you hold to that without wavering. And that's a beautiful, beautiful conviction, a beautiful characteristic I desperately want in my life. Like I said, I haven't been tested like the first picture on the screen, being put to the lions in the Colosseum at Rome. I haven't been facing, like this illustration, the stoning like Stephen. But I hope that I am building a strong faith. I hope that I am not going to backstep and walk away from my faith when things get tough. And that's a beautiful, beautiful characteristic trait that we should all want, where our witness, our testimony is that we believe in God, we have faith in Him, we believe in His promises, we believe in the blood of His Son to wash us clean, and we believe in those things, and we will not let any circumstance dissuade us. We will not let anything lead us to the point where we renounce that faith and those beliefs. That's the kind of faith that you and I, that we should all want. And I think that's a beautiful image in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. It talks about a cloud of witnesses. They've run their race. They've finished. And now they're cheering us on. One of the most dominant ultra-marathon runners is a guy named Scott Jurek, and he's famous for winning so many 100-mile races and winning the Western States 100 in Colorado or California 7 years in a row. But he's famous for when he finishes the race, even if he wins, he'll wait at the finish line. And for a 100-mile race, finishers will come in and for the next, 10 to 12 hours or even longer, because the cutoff between an elite ultra runner and person who just wants to finish the race is hours and hours. And he'll sit there at the end and congratulate people as they cross the finish line. And that's kind of the image here of these martyrs, of these witnesses. They've run their race, and they're cheering us on at the finish line. They're saying, we did it. You go back to Hebrews chapter 11, and we will in just a little bit and read there. And here's all these witnesses to us. They say, I faced death. I faced death for my faith because I wouldn't renounce my God. And Jesus gave me the strength to go through that I did not renounce my faith, and here I am. I've got my crown, I've got my reward, and I'm telling you, whatever trial you're facing, well, I did it. I endured. I didn't walk back. I didn't turn away from God. I didn't renounce my faith, and so you can hold on to your faith too. They're cheering us on, and so I think it's important for us to go back in the Bible and know who these people are and really think about the difficult and life-endangering and life-ending situations these people faced, because they are our witnesses. They are martyrs. They are witnesses to us who cheer us on by their very example, by the very challenges that they faced and overcame with the help of God. They serve to cheer us on. And so we need to know who they are, and we need to appreciate the difficult path that they walked in life and in death. And we need to hope that will give us the strength if we're in those situations, and especially in lesser situations. If faithful disciples of Christ in ages past were put before wild animals in the Colosseum and said, just renounce your faith in Jesus. And if they wouldn't, if they would hold on to their faith, if they would face death, how does that make us look if we are embarrassed or ashamed of our faith just because it might make us look like an outsider at our job. We don't want people to think we're the Jesus freak or something. And so we hide our light. How does that make us look? They would face death and say, I will never renounce my Lord. And for something so much less, just because it makes us feel uncomfortable, the way people look at us or the way people judge us, or people say, oh, it's ridiculous to be a Christian, and therefore we kind of hide our lights. We hide it away, and we act ashamed of the Lord. Their example should be shaming us. Their example should be pushing us on to say, it doesn't matter. You can face far worse than just a little bit of ridicule or criticism. You can face death and still not renounce your faith. That's what Jesus expects of us. And that's what their story tells us. And the most common story, the most common example that people think of, the most recognized martyr is that of Stephen. If you go to Acts chapter 6, and here's what you find a trend, that when great things are happening through the strength of the Spirit of God, when people are being taught the truth, when people are boldly preaching Jesus, well, the enemies of God, Satan, everything that's evil, everything that's dark, they're not going to sit by and say, okay, well, you go ahead and keep doing what you're doing. Whenever great success happens, especially you read the book of Acts, when good things happen, when they succeeded, when they trusted in God, well, that's when the enemy rose up against them, and they had to put their faith to the test. And God would get them through it. And so in Acts chapter 6, we know Stephen, as well as a few other men, there's 7 men total who are chosen in Acts chapter 6 to serve the church and solve this problem and take care of overseeing the distribution to the widows. And Philip is the other one, and we read about him after Stephen. But starting in verse 8, after this little story of how Stephen is chosen to serve the church, it says Stephen went on to do some pretty incredible things. And verse 8, full of grace and power and performing great wonders and signs among the people. But some men from what was called the synagogue of the freedmen, including both Cyrenians and Alexandrians and some from Cilicia and Asia, rose up and argued with Stephen, and yet they were unable to cope with the wisdom and the spirit with which he was speaking. And so what all great minds do when they are beat, they resort to violence. They secretly induced men to say, we have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God. And they stirred up the people, the elders and the scribes, and they came upon him and dragged him away and brought him before the council. They put forward false witnesses and said, this man incessantly speaks against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Nazarene Jesus will destroy this place and alter the customs which Moses handed down to us. And fixing their gaze on him, all who were sitting in the council saw his face like the face of an angel. I've always puzzled over what that verse means, but what we have here is a situation where he is doing great things with the help of God, and that incites challenge. Satan and all his power, all his foes, all of his allies rise up against Stephen. And they can't cope with him. They can't cope with the things he's teaching, the simple and plain truth, and the spirit that's working in him. And so they lie, and they become violent, and they get a riot scene going. And that's always the sign of people who have been intellectually beat, is when they just try to stir people up to violence. That's the sign of people who have been intellectually bettered. When you get to chapter 7, Stephen basically goes through Israel's history, reminding them of how time and time again God has been offering help, offering them insight, and they'd been rejecting it. They'd been rejecting God's prophets. And so in Acts chapter 7 and verse 51, these are kind of his concluding remarks that basically sealed his fate. You men who are stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears are always resisting the Holy Spirit. You are doing just as your fathers did. Which one of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who had previously announced the coming of the righteous one, whose betrayers and murderers you have now become. You who received the law as ordained by angels and yet did not keep it. And then they rushed upon him after plugging their ears and crying out. They rushed on him with one impulse and dragged him away and stoned him to death. And we know he saw a beautiful and calming scene in heaven of Jesus at the right hand of the Father. And that was Jesus keeping his promise that I am with you even to the end of the ages. But we see a man of integrity, a man who would not bend or break his absolute beliefs in Jesus as king. And that's, again, the kind of faith that I want, is a faith like Stephen's. Now, as he mentioned this, like in Matthew 5, that beatitude, he draws our attention backwards. And I want to spend a little time going through the Old Testament, just briefly, and share a few examples, because Stephen draws our attention backwards as he says, which one of the prophets did your forefathers not persecute? And they killed many of them who declared the coming of Jesus. And now you have killed him, the Son of God. Again, this is emphasizing this is the trend. This has been a trend from basically the beginning of time. And in Luke chapter 11, it tells us we can go basically as far back. We can go as far back as Genesis chapter 4 to Cain and Abel, if you want to find the first martyr. In a sense, Abel is a martyr. In Luke chapter 11, there have always been people who did the right thing and paid the ultimate price for it. Luke chapter 11 and verse 50, Jesus says, in order that the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the house of God, yes, I tell you, it shall be charged against this generation. Zechariah is a fellow mentioned in 2 Chronicles, and that's something that kind of goes over our head, the way our Bible is disorganized and cluttered the way it is. But the way their Bible was ordered, the Old Testament that is, 2 Chronicles was the last book. And so you think this is basically Jesus saying from A to Z. Abel is the first, Genesis came at the very beginning, and Zechariah is the last prophet in the Old Testament mentioned to be killed as you read through it. So he's just kind of saying from A to Z, from beginning to end, from cover to cover in the entire book, which prophet have you not killed? Or persecuted or harmed. And so again, this is a trend that goes way back to men like Abel at the very beginning who simply did what was right. God commanded them. God asked for a certain sacrifice. Abel, in faith, obeyed. And he was killed for it. Zechariah, a prophet of God, was killed between the pillars of the temple, it said. 1 Kings chapter 18. Go to this horrible, horrible, wicked person named Jezebel. And, Ahab and Jezebel were just ridiculously, cartoonishly evil. I mean, Disney villains. There's not a good thing about them. And we read in 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 4 of Jezebel's efforts to eradicate every last prophet of God. And so 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 4, and a man named Obadiah comes in and rescues. It says, for it came about when Jezebel destroyed the prophets of the Lord that Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in a cave and provided them with bread and water. God always had his allies, but you see right here that the enemies of God, they're rising up to fight against him, and many prophets were killed. I'm sure if they would have converted and become a prophet of Baal, they probably could have saved their lives, but what would a man gain? What would he profit if he sells his soul and gains the whole world? He loses everything that really matters, and these people understood it. And so even back in the time of Kings, we read of many prophets being killed. I don't know how many were killed at the hands of Jezebel, but by chapter 19, it was so many that it gets to the point where Elijah, in kind of a moment of pitifulness, he says in chapter 19 and verse 10, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, torn down thine altars, and killed thy prophets with the sword. And I alone am left. And they seek my life to take it away also. We know that God comes back to him, and verse 18 of that chapter, he says, I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal. God reminds Elijah, you're not the last one. God says, I always have my remnant. I always have a few faithful. And God says, frankly, I'm at my best when I've got the minority. But nonetheless, Elijah is saying, there have been so many prophets that are killed that I feel like I'm the only one left. Many people martyred. And let's go to Hebrews chapter 11 for just a moment. Hebrews chapter 11. I certainly think that this is talking about people of the Old Testament time, as Hebrews was still very new for the kingdom of Christ, very fresh timeline-wise. And most of Hebrews chapter 11 talks about people like Abraham and Moses and people of the Old Testament like that. So I think in Hebrews chapter 11, I think the people being specified here are people of the Old Testament. That, again, it says there were many people during that time that were martyred, that were killed because of their integrity, simply because they wouldn't reject God, that they would hold on to God and they'd gladly give their lives because they understood what it meant to be rich towards God rather than be rich in this world. In Hebrews chapter 11, in verse 30, well, let's start in verse 35. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, not accepting their release, in order that they might obtain a better resurrection. And there again is the perspective. Like Moses earlier in this chapter, Moses said, I'll give away everything. I'll let go of every bit of wealth I have in this palace in Egypt, because he was looking for a better country. Moses understood and had his priorities right, and that's what's being described here, is people who, they didn't accept release. There's that idea they could have had a way out, but they chose suffering because that was the only way they could hold on to their integrity. That was the only way they could hold on to their faith. They didn't choose the easy way out. They didn't reject God and take pity or mercy. They took their punishment because they were not going to renounce their faith in God. Others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground, and all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. And so we have incredible examples, even in the Old Testament. And you kind of have these intertestamental times. You've got John the Baptist, who, even though he's in the New Testament, it's kind of before Jesus died on the cross. And so, John the Baptist is a martyr. He died because, again, he was giving Herod a hard time. Said, you shouldn't be married to that woman. And he was constantly proclaiming Jesus, and the people didn't like him. And so he died as a result of his faith. And others, we've got James, the son of Zebedee, in the book of Acts, who was beheaded. And you start looking outside of the Bible, you can't really rely on these sources. But basically, most historians believe that other than John, all the apostles died of violent death, with the one exception of John. That's what most people believe. And so the Bible is full, Old and New Testament, of people who were people of integrity, men and women of faith and integrity, who in the face of opposition, in the face of anger, hatred, and violence, and the threats of death, they said, I still choose to be on God's side because I trust him. Because I believe that what he's got planned for me is worth any of this. And so these are great examples, and I just want to talk about a few lessons, a few things that they remind us of. Whether it's any of the prophets from Abel to Zechariah, A to Z, and it's just kind of funny, it's Abel and Zechariah, but, whether it's any one of those prophets of the Old Testament that they rejected and killed and tormented, or any number of New Testament faithful, they all serve to teach us and remind us of some very valuable truths. The martyrs of the Bible, they remind us of the price that was paid in delivering the faith into our hands. In Jude chapter 3, here's what it talks about. It talks about contending for the faith that was handed down to us. And we need to understand that the faith we have, that we can read about, the words of God preserved for us in this book, we ought to be thankful every day. It's an incredible story how this book came to be in your hands. Beloved, while I was making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you, appealing that you contend earnestly for the faith, which was once for all delivered to the saints. And again, on a number of levels, the martyrs remind me of the price that was paid, and remind me of what I need to do and the kind of life I need to live. Shame on me if I don't contend earnestly for the faith, for the troubles that I face, possibly being ridiculed, maybe being made fun of on Facebook. Shame on me if I don't contend for this faith when they faced death and contended for it. The story of how the Bible came to be in our hands in the English language is incredible too. A great book called Fox's Book of Martyrs. I'd recommend any one of you. You can track it down probably on Amazon. It's not too hard to find. And it tells stories going all the way back to Bible times and over the last 2,000 years of men and women who died for their faith. Polycarp, the disciple of John the Baptist, who died, I believe, in the Roman Colosseum, being executed, and said, I've been a Christian for 86 years, and I'm not going to quit now, so go ahead and kill me. Great stories like that. The story of how the Bible is translated, and during the Spanish Inquisition, all kinds of tortures and horrendous crimes against humanity, just because people wouldn't recant, just because they wouldn't renounce their faith and pledge their obedience to the Pope in Rome. All kinds of atrocities were committed. You read about the Bible being translated into English, men like John Wycliffe and others who were punished and hounded throughout their lives, imprisoned, put to death, men like this. William Tyndale. You can read about them in this book, Fox's Book of Martyrs. And these are people that just for trying to translate the Bible from Latin into a readable language were put to death. And they were willing to pay that price. And, again, shame on us if we become ashamed of the gospel for so much less than they did. Their example reminds us that our problems aren't so bad. Back in Hebrews chapter 11, I can't hardly believe some of the things I read here about these great men and women of faith and the things that they endured. In Hebrews chapter 11, again in verse 37 it says, they were stoned. And I don't know how I would handle that. After the first stone, I'd say, okay, I'm sorry, I take back what I said. I hope I wouldn't, but we used to have fights with the little dirt clods as a kid, and every now and then there'd be a rock in one, and he'd hit you in the eye, start crying, and say, no rocks, and that's against the rules. And I get hit with one stone, and I start crying. And I can't imagine being stoned to death, sawn in two. Art's been sawn in two, right there, but probably not quite the same experience as here. I've cut myself before, but I can't imagine. And again, the whole point of martyrdom is that you have a way out. All you got to do is just say, I take back my faith. All you got to do is say, I don't really believe in God. All you got to do is just renounce your faith. There's a way out. I can't imagine the kind of strength these people had, but their example reminds us, as they're witnesses to us, they tell us. That's the kind of strength that ordinary people, that's the kind of strength that God gives to ordinary people. These were people just like you and me in Hebrews chapter 11. They're just like you and me. They just had a great faith in God. This shows us what great faith can accomplish, that when we trust God, we can face those trials. And there are Christians in the world today who face things like this. We can't even fathom that in America. But there are Christians in the world who face life-endangering situations. And they rely on the strength of God's Spirit, maybe more than we can ever understand. But these martyrs, they tell us that. This is the strength that God gives to us to endure. That's why he says in Revelation 2 and verse 10, be faithful even unto death. He asks that of us, and he gives us what we need to accomplish that. We read last week in Romans chapter 8 that neither death nor life can separate us from the love of Christ. Death cannot separate us from the love of Christ. Do we really believe that? Are we willing to put that to the test? Are we willing to bet our lives on it? That's the kind of faith that we need to have. We might never face those situations. We might never be persecuted like that. But this is the kind of faith that God wants of us. And ultimately, they remind us that heaven is worth it all. And in Revelation, you've got the story, chapter 6, and I hope we understand the highly figurative nature of Revelation. So I don't want to digress from our main point here, but in Revelation 6, you encounter these martyrs, these faithful who were slain for obedience to the gospel. And in Romans chapter 6 and verse 9, and when he broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they had maintained. Again, the idea of a witness. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, wilt thou refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwelt on the earth? And there was given to each of them a white robe, and they were told that they should rest for a little while longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who were to be killed, even as they had been, should be completed also. Again, very figurative and symbolic in nature, but I think we can take away from the heart of this that those who have given their lives, who have made that choice to let their lives go so that they could hold on to their God, they're saying to us now, it's worth it. This world is not a perfect place. Evil abides. Evil wins victories all the time in this world. But this world is very short. This world will not last. And that's the perspective we need to have. All of the wrongs will be made right when this world is over. That's why Jesus tells us through Paul in the book of Romans, vengeance is mine, I'll repay. You guys don't worry about vengeance. God says, I'll handle that. I'll take care of that on that last day. People might get away with evil now. Good people like you might suffer and be put to death for your faith. But he says, trust me, it's worth it in the end for you, and I will make all of the wrongs right. I will take care of that. I will do the repaying. I will take care of the vengeance in the end. We just have to trust him. And so their story is incredible. Their stories in the Bible are incredible. They serve as a witness to us. They're cheering us on. They're saying, look at all that we endured. Look at how many of us faced death and didn't reject God. We held on to our beliefs because God empowered us, and you can do the same. We might not ever face a trial like this. Our lives might not ever be put to the test. But I want a faith like this, nonetheless. I might face that situation, but I want a faith that's this strong, that really takes God at his word, that really believes heaven will be worth it all. I want a faith that understands and puts my problems in perspective. I don't want to complain about the littlest inconveniences in this world. I'm thankful I haven't faced some of these trials. I shouldn't complain. I have nothing to complain about. And ultimately, Jesus is the greatest martyr of them all. If you talk about a martyr as someone who could avoid their punishment, well, Jesus said, don't you think I could call 10,000 angels? Don't you think I'd call legions of angels down here and rescue me right away? But Jesus said, I'm not going to. Jesus laid down his life for his principles, for his beliefs, for his mission, because he believed it was worth it to save us. We ought to be thankful for all the faithful who have died serving the Lord because of the example they set for us, because of the sacrifices all those great prophets of the Old Testament made to faithfully proclaim the Word of God, for all of those scribes, for all those people who tried to translate the Scriptures and preserve it for us. We ought to be thankful for the sacrifices they made, that we have the Bible right in front of us in a language we can understand that is a true translation of the original thoughts of God. We ought to be thankful for Jesus, who willingly laid down his life and asks that we give our life to him. If you have not given your life to Jesus this morning, we hope you'll make that decision. We hope you'll make that right. If we can help you do that, please come forward now as we stand and sing.